I want to talk to you about restorative justice, a surprising approach that might offer better outcomes for victims, offenders, and the communities they live in. And I want to suggest that in order for it to work, we all have to do our part. Now, restorative justice is not a new idea. Some people say it's the most common approach to justice across the world and throughout time, but that somewhere along the way, we forgot how to do it. It's a philosophy that says getting justice means repairing harm. In restorative justice, repairing harm happens through face-to-face dialogues between the people harmed and the people responsible. For instance, here in Colorado, hundreds of cases are diverted from the courts each year through restorative conferences that bring together victims, offenders, and affected community members to agree on how to repair harms after a property crime or an assault.
I spent 21 years, 7 months, and 29 days in prison for a crime I did not commit. I'm used to the system feeling me because I'm used to the systems feeling my people. Now the black is garnered is parallel to the experience of like the one slave. You can be taken from a land and put into bondage. It's the same to me as being taken from your community and put in bondage because of the color of your skin. Get involved in correcting the injustice.
Welcome. Season 2, Second Chances. McKinney, I missed you so much, my sister friend.
Too. It's been a long time, huh?
It has. And you know, sometimes this work can be exhausting and it can be very challenging and it's very time consuming and you have to be ready at certain times for certain things. So we apologize for the delay, but we are here to bring you something amazing. We're just coming out of an amazing Women's History Month, and we have been featuring women in the work the entire month. So I will continue. My name is Lulu Cameron. I'm the founder of South Carolina for Restorative Justice. I'm also a justice consultant and an advocate, obviously, for the incarcerated and youth all across this country. And my amazing co-host, McKinney Marsden.
Hi, everyone. My name is McKinney Marsden. I'm the CEO of Bittersweet LLC, and I'm also the advocate for families with wrongfully convicted loved ones.
Yes, thank you so much for being here with us today. We have someone great in store for you. I'm almost a little starstruck, and I was even more excited when I reached out to this organization and found out the executive director was a woman.
Absolutely.
So I am so excited to introduce to everyone tonight Amy Fettig. She is the executive director of the Sentencing Project, and we are going to discuss their new campaign, 50 Years and a Wake Up. But first, we'll tell you a little bit about Amy and all of her wonderful background in this work.
So Amy Fettig is a human rights lawyer and a leading expert on criminal justice reform who has garnered national recognition for her work on prison conditions. Prior to joining the Sentencing Project, she served as a deputy director for the ACLU's National Prison Project. At the ACLU, she litigated federal class action prison conditions caused under Eighth Amendment. Her practice focused on claims regarding medical and mental health care in prisons, solitary confinement, sexual assault and detention settings, and comprehensive reform in juvenile facilities. Fettig also founded and directed the ACLU's Stop Solitary campaign, seeking to end practice of long-term isolation in our nation's prisons, jails, and juvenile detention centers through public policy, reform, litigation, legislation, and public education. Fettig served as a leading member of the National Coalition seeking to end the practice of shackling incarcerated pregnant women, a technical assistance and advice to advocates around the country, and served as a adjunct professor of law in Georgetown University Law Center, where she taught courses on public interest advocacy. Prior to law school, Ms. Fettig worked in incarcerated and familiar incarcerated people and their families in New York City. She holds a BA at Charleston College and a master's in Columbia University. All right, welcome to the show, Ms. Fettig.
Thank you so much for having me, McKinney and Lulu. It's great to be here.
Yes, it's so awesome to just be in your presence. So, the Sentencing Project is kind of like an organization that a lot of us in the grassroots world, or people who are just working, like, because we have family members and loved ones, it's not necessary that we don't all organize or work in conjunction with large national organizations. So a lot of times the work that your organization does helps us to further the efforts that we're doing on a local level, from the grassroots perspective. So, everything has to be supported with the data and with the information, and with a big brother, a big sister who has also proven some of the facts and details that we're studying or trying to present to legislators to create change all around the country. So, we are definitely people who are connected to loved ones who are incarcerated. And so I guess every time we find someone in the work, we are always interested in their why. What brings you to this place? What makes you interested in doing this type of work? Because in many circles, the incarcerated is kind of like a lost group of people. And most people who are not connected to incarceration, they don't even really have a clue of anything that's going on. It's kind of like the extremely wealthy person curious about how the cost of a gallon of milk. So what would you say your why is?
What brought me to this work in the first place? Why am I here? Yeah, that's always a good question, because there's no doubt that this work is hard, right? It's tough, but it's also necessary. And it's my own path was somewhat unexpected. I actually started out in New York City. I was going to graduate school to work on international human rights, and I had taken Chinese, and I was concerned about women in China and their treatment, and women in Asia, and I was working with a lot of young women advocates all around the world, really. And this was in the early and mid 90s, a long time ago. And through that, I just was sitting at my desk one day at Columbia University, which is right next to Harlem. And I was reading all this data, actually, about young women in Korea. And the data had been sent to me by all these activists, young women activists, about violence against young women in Korea. And I thought, wow, this is so amazing. They know their community so well. They care about their community so well. And then I thought, I'm sitting at 116th Street, and I've never been to Harlem. It's at 125th. It's back in 1994. And that made me think, what am I doing with my life? I don't know anything beyond a pretty narrow, pretty privileged demographic about what's happening for women in this country. And while I do think it is important for us to care about what's happening around the world, for me, that just made me start to think, what am I responsible for? What's happening to women who who don't have access to the kind of resources I do, who don't have the color of skin that I do in this country. And so when I graduated, instead of taking a job, like I thought, oh, I'm going to work for the United Nations or something like that, I ended up taking a job at the Women's Prison Association in New York City. And I walked in to my first prison ever, spending a whole day with incarcerated women in New York. And after that day, when I walked out, my first thought was, thank God I get to leave. And my second thought was, but for the grace of God go I. And then I can't believe that we're doing this to people in the country, a country where I vote, where this is supposed to be a democracy. How can this be happening? It's being done in my name. And that sort of started me on the trajectory. At the time, I wasn't a lawyer. And I spent a couple of years working with incarcerated women and women who were newly returned to the community in New York, and decided at that time, it was 1996, things have changed a little bit, but at that time I thought, wow, if I'm going to do criminal legal reform, I'm going to need a law degree because they won't take me seriously if I'm a woman. And I need to understand the law more than I do now. And at that time, what I understood was a lot of people were going to prison for no good reason, and they were spending a really long time there. And then I went to law school, and I still understand that a lot of people are going to prison.
Yeah.
Been a long time there, and they don't need to be there. And that has become my life's work. First I concentrated on what are the conditions people are living in, because I saw the horrors. And I wanted to ensure that people could get home, that they wouldn't die while they were incarcerated, because so many of our sisters and brothers do, or they become so harmed that they can never return home and thrive in the way that they deserve to be able to. And then I came to the Sentencing Project because I thought, well, maybe the second half of my career, I will concentrate on getting people free.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds awesome. You can go ahead, McKinney.
So I have a question. With mass incarceration, poverty, and a drug epidemic, sorry about that, coupled with lack of access to treatment, have resulted in criminalization of mentally ill. So with your expertise, how could we resolve these issues? Do you feel like maybe using person first language would actually trigger a change in looking a little more humane?
Yeah. I mean, that's an important first step. Absolutely. The story of mass incarceration in this country and the criminal legal system is a story of othering individuals, because no one would think, oh, I want my brother to be subject to this, or I want my mother to be subject to this. But by thinking that it's someone else, it's always someone else who's got that problem, someone else who's not quite like you. Then people justify that in their mind. So that othering has got to stop. It's easy to inflict things on people that you don't think you're accountable to. And so first of all, understanding that the folks who are sitting in cells today are just like you and me in every single way, except for usually they had some, like you said, there's substance use disorder, there's poverty, there's mental illness, there's lack of access to resources, lack of access to education. I mean, our entire mass incarceration system is really built on our failure to invest in a social safety net that would actually lift people up rather than dragging them down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a very interesting that you say that, because I think people have lost the idea and understanding that if you invested more in people and their mindsets and what they thought and knew to be correct and right, we could be so much further along. Mm-hmm. And I think what kind of like catches me off guard about the United States of America, because naturally we're here having this conversation because there are areas and things about this country that they need to correct. And they need to take ownership of the faults that they have inflicted upon mass numbers of people. And the sad part is it's your own people. And yet we are the victor running to every other country to help resolve and solve problems. And yet we continue to turn a blind eye to some of the most crucial parts of what we have going on. And so I think kind of what really interested me to kind of reach out to the sentencing project this time around, right? You know, I've always utilized the sentencing project for one of my own projects or another, but I didn't know that there were real people behind all of the data that I was using, right? And so I was like, let me just reach out and see who responds. However, when I saw the new campaign, 50 years and a wake up, I was just really like, wow, what does that mean? 50 years and a wake up. You know, I'm someone who's constantly educating people about the mass incarceration problem that we have in the United States and how it derived from the 13th Amendment and slavery and things like that. But what does 50 years and a wake up mean? And so I started to do my research, but I think that in part of what kind of excited me about, you know, a national organization taking a real life lead onto something that could be big instead of, you know, just passing like lukewarm regulations, helping, you know, some level of criminal justice reform, but not necessarily actually working on reforms that would change people's lives in real life. I thought I need to reach out to this organization directly and find out if someone can kind of educate us because, you know, just like you hear people say, it's like, I got, when they're getting ready to get out, they say, I got, you know, 3 more days and a wake up. And so I thought of that immediately when I heard 50 years and a wake up. And then when I saw Just Leadership partner in the campaign movement, I thought to myself, how cool would it be? We're connected to grassroots organizations all across the country. You know, we got Ignite Justice, Be Frank for Justice in Texas. Ignite Justice is kind of like a national thing, but they're grassroots organizers, Breaking the Chains, the National Plus Coalition. And so what I thought would be an excellent opportunity is for us all to find a way to connect to that campaign and be a part of that movement on a national level. And instead of it just being some of the big national organizations who we already know have millions of dollars, we could actually deploy the concepts of, you know, the people being closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And we know who says that. Make sure we go ahead and, you know, give him his props for that because he would not have it any other way. So we just want to make sure that we're just repeating it and we know that, you know, this is a very real thing, a very real scenario. So I just wanted to make sure that we extended the opportunity for you all to explain what 50 years and a wake up really means.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you reached out, Lulu, because working with folks who are doing amazing things in communities around the country is the best part of the work that we do, and my favorite part. So 50 years and a wake up is our campaign for 2023. Because unfortunately, this year marks the 50th year of mass incarceration in this country. 1973 is the date that we can start seeing the enormous increase in the number of people who are incarcerated in this country. And it has gone up over 500% since that year. And importantly, one thing folks don't often recognize is that during that same time, the number of people who are serving life behind bars has grown to over 200,000 people. That's more than were in our entire prison system in 1972. So mass incarceration is not only about the number of people that we bring into our system, it's about how long they stay there and how extreme our sentences are, and just how out of whack our punishment is with any other country in the world. That we now have more people behind bars than anyone else. I mean, that is such an enormous shame and an enormous human waste. And it's also an enormous cost. You know, conservative estimates, over $80 billion a year. And to Lulu and McKinney, to both of your points about, well, what kind of country could we be? Could we have been if instead of locking our people up, warehousing them, throwing away the key, we had invested in our people, and invested in affordable housing and good education and jobs that allow you to feed a family and have a dignified life. Um, that would have made us an actually a much safer country than we are now. But it's also true. So we've got 50 years. We've learned a lot in 50 years. We know what doesn't work because it's been what we've been doing. We also know, like restorative justice, we know what makes people safer. We know what heals people in a much more concrete way. We have solutions. And the question now in 2023, as opposed to 1973, is, are we brave enough? Are we smart enough? And are we humane enough to actually do what we know works best for our people? And that's an open question right now, unfortunately. Yeah. So with this campaign, we want to focus on that, the 50 years and a wake up, that, building off what folks say on the inside, like I've got my sentence of 50 years and then wake up is the day I go home. But it's also like, hey, America, wake up. 50 years of this? How many generations of Americans are going to be lost until we actually start doing the right thing?
Right.
Yeah, and that's
genocide.
Yeah, and it's so true, because a lot of times what I think also that's missing from the component of people who do commit crimes is that we are not taking into consideration the victims. So victims do have rights and they should have rights. But I think the way that we go about giving victims rights is what also needs to be considered. I am someone who is a survivor of a violent sexual assault at the age of 12. And so what didn't work for me was the way that the justice system handles, a person who is, I could be a beautiful woman and then all of a sudden I say that I'm raped, and the way that I'm treated after that can be pragmatic. And then going through the process where you see people are punished, but because a person is in prison, doesn't mean that I'm healed. It doesn't mean that I'm better. Right now, it means that as I grow into an adult, whether or not that person is in prison because of crimes committed against me or not, it means that I have to figure out my own healing. However, there are millions and millions of dollars going into people being incarcerated, but there is very little money going into offering me any types of services. And that's just something that I realized to be like a huge need, because you have a victim and you may not recognize the damage that's been done to your person until, for me, I was in my 30s before I started feeling the impacts of what had actually been done, because I buried it so deeply. And so once I realized, hey, I really needed some form of healing, some form of opportunity to meet with someone, beyond those first 2 years. And so I just think about that. And then as I listen to, those who are incarcerated speak about wanting to right the wrongs in the communities that they committed crime. And you see so many formerly incarcerated people getting out of prison and actually making huge impacts in the places where they came from. It speaks to the soul of a person that is impacted and understands fully the breakdown of this. You can be born into, some different circumstances. And I'm not saying that that justifies crime, but at the end of the day, I wouldn't just assume that one size fits all either. And so I think that's what we've done as a country. And just to see people kind of get behind, the efforts is really, really kind of amazing to me. So, I applaud that. And I applaud all the work that you've done leading up to, even like in the advocacy portion of your work throughout. Was it when you were in Colombia, or was that, I know that you did some advocacy training for people who, were out in the community and wanted to learn how to be better advocates, because that's the thing. You need to know how to do it. You can't just say, hey, this is wrong. You have to be able to assert yourself in a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think, Lulu, going to your point about the way that we treat people who are victimized, especially by violent crime in this country. It's so rarely heals people. I mean, we're told that justice is about putting people behind bars and putting them there for the longest possible time. But somehow that is going to make people healed, that somehow that's going to make up for the trauma that people suffer. And what we find actually increasingly, especially with groups representing people of color who've been victimized, we hear survivors saying, that's not what we need to heal. That is not actually going to give us justice. What we need is a process. What we need are services. Like you, did you actually get counseling? Did you get access to mental health care? Did you get access to support in the community? So
No, not at
frequently,
all.
yeah, from survivors, nobody does. You know, I have a colleague of mine whose son was murdered, and he was murdered during a robbery which he was committing. And not only did the police not call her, she found out because a friend of hers saw it on television. And then when she went to the police, they told her, you know, because of the way your son died, you're not going to have any access to any victim services, and nor will his two small children. And I
Yikes.
think, what kind of services are there? Those that mean, like, not all victims are the same. Not everybody deserves to heal, and that's the kind of attitude that perpetuates trauma. And that's
Yeah.
the kind of trauma that we see perpetuating violence in our community. Because the truth is that so many of the folks who are sitting in prison cells today who have committed some serious harm, they were victims first.
Yeah.
They suffered trauma. They suffered untreated trauma.
Yeah.
And because of that, they didn't have the skills they needed to deal with what happened to them. Now, not everybody who is victimized by violent crime is going to go out and commit harm.
Right.
But it is very true that those who do commit harm have been victimized and are traumatized and have not gotten the support that they needed. And so what we have done as a country in this age of mass incarceration is talk a lot about how we do justice for people who have suffered without actually producing much support for them.
Yeah.
And at the same time, perpetuating a cycle of violence, which we know how to end. If we invested in our community, if we invested in people who have suffered some form of violence, by giving them access to the resources they need and the medical care and the mental health care and the ongoing support, we wouldn't be seeing these cycles of violence in communities that have been going on for decades now.
Yeah.
You know, so it's time to wake up.
Yeah. I just think, wait, and I don't mean to cut you off, McKinney, but just on the flip side of that, like devil's advocate, right? Because this is a constant conversation that we have. Are people who committed violent crimes worthy of a second chance? Now, I say that they are, but since you're the expert, and I know that the website shows a lot of data that supports giving violent offenders a second chance, what are the most effective ways that this information can be used to build momentum and generate legislative changes? Like, my story of wanting wanting that healing and also wanting legislative change for those who are incarcerated. So what's the best way you would say that we should go about that?
Well, absolutely. And Lulu, I think you have put your finger on something that's really important and something that has changed in the last decade. And that is the voices of survivors calling for more, calling for actual healing, calling for resources in the community. So that's an important piece. I also think that it is important for us to start expanding how we think about justice. You know, mass incarceration has been about warehousing people. It's been about treating people like widgets and not people. And we need to end that because it doesn't bring justice and it doesn't create safe and thriving communities. One of the ways that we should think about this too is, well, what actually does create public safety? And what does the data tell us? Because now we have decades of research. And what does the research say? In particular, people are always concerned about folks who have committed a violent offense. And what we know actually, and this is one of the most well-established facts in all of criminology in the United States and across the globe. It's the basic fact that people age out of crime.
Yeah.
those who commit crime, it happens the late teens, mid up to the mid 20s. And then when you hit 30, 40, 50, 60, it falls off tremendously.
Gotcha.
So even if you committed a crime like 19, the vast majority of crimes are committed when people are young, especially violence. By the time you hit 30, 40, 50, the likelihood of you ever committing another crime, especially another violent crime, is vanishingly small. So those
Yeah.
sentences that we hand out, the decades behind bars, they make no impact on public safety whatsoever. Because we have the wrong people behind bars. We don't have people who are actually a public safety threat behind bars.
Right.
Those are folks who, they can go home, they can thrive, and they just need support to do that. There's no reason to keep people behind bars. So that means what has happened in this age of mass incarceration? Our fastest growing population behind bars in this country for the first time in our history are those who are 55 and older. We are guarding grandma and grandpa. And
Yeah.
what we learned from COVID is that prisons and jails are terrible places to be old. They are terrible places to be medically vulnerable. People behind bars died at huge rates because of COVID, because you
Yeah.
can't get decent medical care. And these are folks who haven't gotten good access to care, sometimes for decades, so that they've actually been sentenced to death by incarceration, which is completely ridiculous. So we need to get our elders home. They don't need to be behind bars. They can live in the community safely. There is no reason for them to be in prison and jail at this moment. And frankly, they are costing us millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars because their medical care, although bad, is also expensive. So why not invest that in the community so people can return home, be with their families, and contribute to society rather than being locked up and dying in a horrible, awful way.
I
Right.
agree with you 100%. How can individuals that are incarcerated more effectively contribute to participate in the sentencing reform movement?
Well, I want to tell you about the work that we do in Michigan in particular. So, at the Sentencing Project, we have our campaign to end life imprisonment. We think extreme sentences need to go. They don't make us safe, and they aren't just or humane. We are actually working with community activists in Michigan across the state. And some of the people that we are working with are incarcerated. The Michigan Lifers Association, that is active in a number of prisons across the state, have been our partners in this work to introduce second look legislation. They helped us write the legislation. They informed us about what the community actually needed. And they are present. We've been able to actually have them call in at our meetings. We are go into the prison to meet with them. They actually just sent my colleague Alex Bailey, who is our campaign strategist, a wonderful T-shirt that they all signed from one of the prisons. And we get cards, and people are so thoughtful. It just warms our heart. But this is incredibly important because those voices that are behind bars, you know what it's like. They are the most convincing witnesses to why extreme sentences are wrong in this country and not good for the community or public safety. And so when we are working with states, we're always working with directly impacted communities, grassroots activists on the ground. And Michigan has a very organized Lifers Association, but it is not the only state because, as I mentioned before, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people serving life in every single state in this country. And they are organizing behind bars, talking to one another, getting organized. So part of the work that we do is to ensure that those voices are front and center in our campaigns to end mass incarceration.
Well, I think that that's awesome just to know that you work with other community organizations and keep me in mind because, I am constantly connecting with larger organizations and it's like hands off South Carolina. But I feel like South Carolina has an opportunity to, you know, do away with some of its harmful, hurtful pasts. And I think that they're very well aware of the past in South Carolina, and they are very well aware of the need for change. And I just think that sometimes when we have the legislation and we bring it forward, if we don't have enough support nationally, it becomes very cumbersome for groups to actually see any change take place. And that can be the most debilitating part of this work, because you're trying so hard to get people to support legislation, Senate Bill 277 or whatever it is, and then you don't have enough people pushing and pushing, then it's like it's dead at the water. And then the people on the inside that we're connected to, you just see the hope just fading and fading. You have some years where people were very strong from the inside in their efforts, like even like the people in Alabama, those guys over in Alabama prisons, they are serious, right? They are serious about being a part of their own movement. And that's because their circumstances are so extreme. It's just like, well, we either die trying or we're going to die either way because of the environment inside of the Alabama prisons. And then there's just different pockets of culture based on geographical location. And so oftentimes it's difficult for me to be an advocate for the incarcerated in South Carolina, because you don't have enough of the family showing up, or people don't have family because people have served such long, lengthy sentences. The family is dead, right?
Yeah.
And so there's that, or just people don't have an understanding, or they're fearful for whatever reason that may be. And so it's always a help to know that an organization, a grassroots organization that's doing the work, can be supported by a national or more well-respected organization, when you think about it along the lines of legislators and people in positions of power and leadership. And so I think it's a constant battle to always be seen and heard. But then when you are supported by organizations like the Sentencing Project, it really helps to amplify the efforts that are being made. So, kudos to you all for taking part in some of the ugly stuff that goes on in Michigan, because we all know there are a lot of
Yeah.
people there.
So I read something that said that there are 64% of incarcerated individuals who have reported mental health concerns. And I just wanted to know from your stats, is that number correct, or is it a little bit higher or lower?
It depends upon the jurisdiction, and it also depends upon gender. So for women, the number of women who both report but also who have histories of mental health issues or existing diagnosis at the moment that they're incarcerated is extremely high. It goes up even into the 70s, and I would say it's generally an underreport across the board, whether you're a woman or a man. The mental health issues are pervasive in both prisons and jails. It's always over 50% for men and always above 60% for women in general. And like I said, that is generally an underreport. So those are conservative estimates. So that tells you something. It tells you that our prisons and jails are functioning as mental health hospitals in this country. And that is a horrible thing that we have done, because prisons and jails are designed to control people. They are not designed to treat people. I can't imagine a worse environment in which to place somebody who has a mental health issue. And that's why my work in solitary confinement, essentially, if you have a very serious mental health problem in a prison and jail, your odds of ending up in solitary confinement because of the nature of your disease are extremely high. There are oftentimes units that are almost entirely lived in by people who really need to be in a mental health crisis treatment center instead.
Is there an example? Is anybody getting it right? Like, is there any prison? Because I mean, as an adult, the older that we get, we recognize that everyday people got a lot of mental health with them, right? You're like, oh, she's a little bit touched sometimes, right? But when people are in prison, I just wonder because you always hear about prisons being sued because of the mental health care that they do or do not deploy within their institutions. But is there anyone who is leading the way in the United States as it relates to mental health that you can think of?
I mean, sadly, there are not great examples. There are some that are better than others. I think the bottom line we always have to remember is that we can't turn prisons or jails into mental health hospitals and treatment centers. They're not designed to do that. They're set up to fail, and they do. It's just like asking police to be mental health counselors. Why would you ever do that? It's a horrible, horrible idea. They're not trained to do that. That's really not what they're supposed to be doing, and they fail at it miserably, and they hurt people. Same thing happens in prisons. We just hear about it less because, frankly, you don't have cell phones in prisons. You don't have eyewitnesses in prison. As you probably experienced, it is hard to get info. I used to need a court order to get into an actual prison, let alone a visiting room. So what happens behind bars stays behind bars until something awful, awful, awful happens. And we shouldn't have to wait for people to die before doing the right thing and acting humanely.
Yeah, and the sad part, and I just have to laugh when you say there aren't cell phones in prisons because we know that there are. However, the big push to get rid of cell phones in prisons, they always deploy the idea behind gangs and violence. Well, really, I really think it's the exposure, like what's being exposed about what's going on inside of these institutions that you just don't like. And, you don't want your peers to know that your big time director position at a prison is actually a human crisis. And so I think that, it's just funny, like to me, because to me, it would make sense for mental health purposes to at least have cell phones that allowed phone calls and video calls and nothing else if you wanted to control that component of it. But it's like prisons are created to destroy the family, to destroy the person, to break a person down to nothing because they are reminded constantly that they're in prison and that they're less than. And then you're ruining the family. Just for example, like we have been, basically throughout COVID, visitations have not been the same. So you think about children that love their mother or their father who are incarcerated, and all of a sudden you can't see that person, or you can see them, but it's behind a glass, and so you can't touch them. And, even in South Carolina, we're still wearing masks, and there are certain places that are still behind the glass, and visitation is still only an hour and 20 minutes. And then you want to release people to their families, but their families don't know them anymore. If you don't talk to me in 3 years, and then it's just like all of a sudden, you talk to me, but you don't see me, you don't interact with me. How are families supposed to take on the post-traumatic incarceration syndrome that occurs to those who are incarcerated? And then the trauma of the stories that we hear from family members when people are released into society and they've just been sitting for however many years that they've been incarcerated, especially if you're considered a violent offender. Violent offenders are least likely to receive rehabilitative programming. But if your mindset is one that thought that the things that you did that landed yourself in prison was just a part of the lifestyle that you lived, was just the way that you grew up, it's just what you knew, what are we doing to deprogram the things that people think and or do that are incorrect? And so there needs to just be some accountability. And so that's why, when you talk about second look legislation, and even as we push for good time legislation all around the country, those are types of things that deploy a morale change inside of the prisons by the incarcerated population. And it also holds the prisons and institutions in different states responsible for deploying proper rehabilitative programming. If you have to be able to earn credits, you have to be able to have a way to earn them. And over a period of time, it's just like an exercise, right? If I do sit-ups X amount of days in a row for X amount of years, I'm probably going to have some abs, right? But if I never do sit-ups and I just sit back and eat processed food that also, messes with my mind and my mental health, and I'm always made aware of the crime that I committed, whether it was yesterday or 35 years ago, how do you expect me to be something different when nothing new has been put into me? And so this is not like rocket science. It's very simple, and it seems like it's very easy to depict what the problems are. There's science to back it up. There's research and data. And what is it? Like, what makes them being the people in positions of leadership or legislators, besides money and greed, just say,
That's
who cares?
that's all it is. The prison system is not really formatted for there to be any rehabilitation at all. It's meant to break the foundation of families. It's meant for children to not have relationships with their parents or their loved one that's in there. It's meant to stop growth. They don't
Right.
care. It's all about capitalism. It's all about how they're going to continue to get more money and keep the money train going with the people that's in their small proximity of organizations, companies, and things like that, privatized prisons and things like that. They don't want to
Yeah.
see us rehabilitated at all. They don't want to see our families healed. So it's really up to us and the communities that we're a part of to take that initiative to have these, somehow figure out a way to have these mental health clinics in the communities so that we can start getting some free treatment for our children, because it's a continuous cycle. That's all it is. We already know they don't care.
Right.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it's very true that prisons do not rehabilitate. They oftentimes say that that is part of their mission, but the way prisons are set up in this country, they do very, very little rehabilitation. I've always thought that, so many of my clients behind bars, they rehabilitated themselves. That system did not support them. In fact, it traumatized them more than anything else. And that was in spite of being incarcerated, not because of being incarcerated, that they actually, you know, came to peace and found a different way of doing things, and were ready to come home and didn't need to be behind bars. Unfortunately, we spend billions and billions and billions of dollars every single year locking people up, but a very, very small, insignificant portion of that is used to actually give anybody education and programming and treatment. We don't spend the money on the things that would actually make people's lives better, that would allow them to return home and thrive in the community. So we're investing in all of the wrong things. And it's because the system is not designed to actually rehabilitate people. It's designed to warehouse them, and warehouse them poorly. So it is not an answer to the problems that solve us. And the irony is, drug treatment, mental health care, education, housing, all of that is so much cheaper than anything we invested behind bars. And we know it works better because all of us know what safe, thriving communities look like. Like you said, Lulu, it's not rocket science. Affordable housing, access to good jobs, good education, playgrounds, good roads, all that stuff. It's not that difficult to figure out what we're doing wrong. The problem is the political will to actually do it right.
The political will, as you said, is absolutely correct. And that, every day, I try to treat people the way that I want to be treated, because I know that even though it may just be one person that I'm impacting, at least I've impacted one person, right? With gestures of kindness or behavior. But it just behooves me as a human being to see us spend so much money on humanitarian crises all around the globe, because we're the United States of America. And I just want us to start pruning our own bushes, cutting our own grass, holding ourselves accountable for the damage and the things that we've done that haven't been right. And it's not a Republican problem and it's not a Democrat problem. It's just a human being problem that we have. And, it's just really unfortunate that we have found ourselves in this predicament, because you see the growth. Well, I do personally because I know a lot of incarcerated people, they're running the programs, they're rehabilitating themselves and then rehabilitating others and helping others to walk the path of, redemption to arrive at some place that will allow them to live a better life than the one that initially landed them in their current circumstance. And I just, for the life of me, cannot understand why all across this country does it have to be so difficult to just make some changes that you would want made for yourself or your son. And it's really kind of unsettling for me because now when I walk out of the house and I see who's standing on the corner begging for money because of their opioid addiction, it's no longer people who look like me as it was back in the 90s and stuff like that. And so now we see all these drug bills and, the president's son has an addiction issue. And so people with addiction shouldn't be in prisons. They should be in mental health and in rehabilitation centers. But apply that math to everything. Apply that math to everyone that's a human being. We're passing all these abortion laws and saying that heartbeats matter. They should matter in the uterus, in the womb, in the arms, cradling a mother who doesn't have the money to buy the milk that she needs. And it should still apply to a human being 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years old that are locked inside of the prisons or just in unfortunate circumstances. And so, we all do our part. That's all that we can do.
Some people don't do their part. Some people are part of the problem. And I would say that the political leaders that brought us mass incarceration that have sustained it for political reasons. I mean, we know that the war on drugs that was started by Nixon was all about undermining the Black vote in the 1970s. That's what brought us mass incarceration, that deep-seated racism in this country that allowed people to use the criminal legal system as a proxy for their own racism. That continues. I mean, we are seeing the reemergence of that in the COVID era, where some crime has gone up in some jurisdictions, not across the board, but in some places. Not surprisingly, given that people were locked up, social dislocation, chaos, fear, mental health problems.
Yeah.
That's it. I would be shocked if crime rates hadn't gone up after such a generationally traumatic experience as COVID. But we see political leaders using it to fearmonger over the actual facts, as they did in the 70s and 80s and the 90s. And we all know that it's coded racism. It's same original sin of this nation that comes back to bite us again and again again, and we continue to commit human rights atrocities now in the name of public safety that has nothing to do with it. Mass incarceration was not about crime rates. Crime rates actually have been coming down since the 90s. What fueled mass incarceration was not an increase in crime. It was largely an increase in sentences and the way we treated infractions. We brought more people in than we did before, and we kept them there longer. It wasn't about an influx of crime everywhere. It was the way we treated people. And in particular, that was justified in people's minds because white people didn't think it was going to touch them. Now it has, and it does, but it primarily, a mass incarceration is targeted poor people, and especially poor people of color. And that continues to be the case today. So we have to guard against it. One thing that we also work on at the Sentencing Project, in addition to trying to roll back extreme sentences, is voting rights for justice involved people, because we know that mass incarceration started as a way to undermine the Black electorate and to neutralize the Black voice in American politics in the 1970s. And it has successfully done that in a lot of ways by disenfranchising over 5 million people in this country. Laws have been passed to actually expand voting rights, especially for people in the community on probation and parole, but there are still jurisdictions in this country where that's not the case. We still have people who are disenfranchised for a lifetime. And of course, people inside, over 2 million people on any given day in prisons, and hundreds of thousands more in jails, regularly are disenfranchised by either the nature of their custody, being convicted of a felony in a prison. Only Vermont and Maine, now the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, allow people who are convicted and in prison to vote. And then we have people in jails, literally hundreds of thousands on any given day, who actually could vote, but they don't have access to the polls.
Yeah.
So we need to bring the voting booth in there to allow people to exercise their franchise. We want to have universal suffrage so that it doesn't matter if you're in prison or you're in the community, everybody gets to vote. Because until we do that, mass incarceration is always going to be used as a way to ensure that especially the Black community doesn't have their say in this democracy.
Wow, that was so. Look, that was almost like poetry. That was very, very well said. It's just been a pleasure to have a woman of your caliber who is in the work, being a part of, just the efforts that we make on and off the scene, on camera, off camera, as well as, just being a part of the deep work that has to be done and helping us to have some of the difficult conversations, because like you said, it is an issue of poor white, Black, and brown communities that are overly exposed to the criminal legal system in the United States of America. And so I just want to salute you. I appreciate it. I want to invite everyone to join forces with the Sentencing Project. So you can find them at thesentencingproject.org. You can also find them and some of their replays of work that they do. Some of them are on YouTube. They have some really great statistics for all of those grassroots organizations that are out there that would in some way, shape, or form benefit by utilizing some of the details and data that they've dug deep and found for us to, present your conversations or your arguments when speaking with legislators or people in positions of power, or just communities that need to be educated on the ramifications of mass incarceration. So, Amy, I definitely appreciate you. And I look forward to, future partnership with you as well as the Sentencing Project organization, whether it be for myself personally, Lulu Cameron, or South Carolina for Restorative Justice, because we can use as many comrades and, collaborative efforts as possible to make some real change across this country. So, Makini, it's okay. Just going to let them be in this.
Well, I want to thank both Lulu and McKinney, both of you, for inviting me. It's been such a great conversation. I'm looking forward to being both in community and in partnership with you. I want to encourage all of the folks listening to this also in a grassroots organization. Please join us in 50 Years and a Wake Up. We want as many folks as possible to be recognizing this year and to be pushing back on mass incarceration. It's time we started to end this, and we need to end it as quickly as possible, because the lives, communities, and frankly, our strength as a democratic nation are really at risk here. The future depends upon us being able to end mass incarceration and strengthen our democracy so that everyone has a voice in the future. Because otherwise, I'm not looking forward to that future, and if we continue on this track.
Me either. Well, I thank you all for joining us this evening. This has been your first episode of the second season of Second Chances. I'm so glad to be back on. It's been a while, and we hope that you all enjoyed tonight's show. Thank you for joining us, and see you again in 2 weeks. Have a great day.